All right, you guys. So today we are going to kind of continue talking about the Cold War a little bit. I thought this might help you guys give you some background information a little bit of what you guys are reading, what you're seeing in these textbook pages, what you're learning about on your worksheets, and all that other stuff. So this presentation is primarily about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, which are two pretty big pieces of the Cold War. What I need you guys to understand about the Cold War is, first of all, the reason why it's called a Cold War, as some of you may have learned already, is that the Cold War basically means it's a war, but we're not really fighting in a war. It means that we are having disagreements with people, or we're always on the verge of a war, but no war actually starts. Okay, so now this may be confusing because we've talked about the Korean War, and we right now in this PowerPoint presentation we've got the Vietnam War being mentioned and stuff like that. Those are separate issues. The Cold War as a whole is basically a conflict between the United States and Russia, or United States and the Soviet Union. Or even if you want to look at it on a broader spectrum, it's between the United States, who has a democratic system of government, and the Soviet Union, who has a communistic type of government. So it's basically democracy versus communism. We go into Vietnam and Korea because of the fact that it's based on communism. Okay, so that's kind of like the background of the Cold War. The Cold War lasts from about 1945 to around 1991. So it kind of spans a really big piece of time. So there's a lot for us to cover over this kind of next couple chapters because of the fact that it's just such a long, huge period of time. So these are kind of some of the more important pieces that we're going to talk about related to the Cold War. Okay, so first of all, we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, so this is where we get missiles to Cuba. In 1962, the Soviets sent ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads to communist Cuba. Cuba is only 90 miles away from the U.S. If you guys were to look at a map of the United States and parts of Latin America and South America, if you look at the map, Cuba is kind of directly south of Florida. So they're about 90 miles away from us. So they're pretty close. That's why it was kind of seen as a crisis, because they were so close. And Russia had placed these nuclear warheads, which you remember, nuclear warheads are basically the atomic bomb. Okay, that's what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. So we're kind of a little worried about that. As it says in this PowerPoint, the missiles could have easily destroyed the southeastern states with no problem at all because of the fact that Cuba was so close. Okay, so in this map, you can see this is Cuba right here. And then this is the very bottom of Florida. So this is about as close as they are to us. That's why we're kind of freaking out at this moment, because they've got these giant Soviet ballistic missiles over here. That's what's pictured in this photograph. There's a bunch of them right here on this island that's super, super close to the United States. Now, these red lines out here are basically the range that some of these missiles have, meaning that if they were to fire off of this island of Cuba, some of them could make it all the way up here into Canada, or at least the effects of that missile could be felt all the way up here in Canada. Okay, so that's a big issue for the United States, because almost all of the United States is encapsulated into those circles. Okay, so the United States is kind of freaking out at this moment. All right, so now we go to a blockade, which, if you guys remember, a blockade is basically you're trying to stop things. It's like you put up a wall almost. You're trying to block something out, or you're trying to protect yourself with this wall of usually ships. Okay, so at the time, the U.S. President John F. Kennedy ordered the U.S. Navy to blockade Cuba. The Navy allowed no Soviet ships into Cuba. So all of the U.S. Navy, or at least most of the U.S. Navy, is surrounding Cuba and making sure that no Soviet ships are able to make it ashore Cuba. President Kennedy also sent troops to Florida in case the U.S. needed to invade Cuba. So not only are the United States, are the Navy ships protecting, blockading Cuba, but there's a ton of soldiers that are in Florida ready to kind of go at a moment's notice if crap hits the fan. Okay. After 13 tense days, the Soviets finally backed down and pulled their missiles out of Cuba. The U.S. narrowly escaped a nuclear war. Okay, so this is a huge deal. People were panicking all the time. This is where you see those drills of the air raid drills, where it was serious enough to where, people were building bomb shelters. Kids were being taught to the duck and cover drills. It was a big deal for these people. A lot of Americans were scared that we were going to go into a nuclear war, and all of a sudden the Cold War was going to turn hot, and we were going to have a really big war again with the Soviet Union. But anyway, so in this photograph, this is a U.S. Navy P-2H Neptune flying over a Soviet cargo ship carrying weapons in 1962. So this is a United States Navy plane and then flying over a Soviet ship. So that's what's going on in this picture. Okay, so in this photograph, this is President Kennedy signing the Proclamation of Interdiction of Delivery of Offensive Weapons to Cuba at the Oval Office on October 23rd, 1962. Okay, so this John F. Kennedy, when this is his second year in office. Okay, so this is October 1962. He ends up getting assassinated in November of 1963. So this is like probably the most famous thing that comes out of President Kennedy's presidency, besides his crazy affairs and really not being a very good husband. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is huge for President Kennedy. It's kind of what makes him a famous president, or it's one of the things that makes him a famous president. Okay. All right. So now we're moving into the Vietnam War. So in the 1960s, the U.S. became involved in the Vietnam War. So Vietnam is a country that's in Southeast Asia that was divided into two parts in 1954. Okay, so this is an area that's in Asia. It's by China and stuff like that, where it's a kind of really thin country that was split in two in 1954. North Vietnam was communist and South Vietnam was not. So that's comparable to North Korea and South Korea today. So just like Korea is split in two parts, and one is kind of communist and kind of looked at as not very good people, and then the South is the better one. Okay, so that's pretty much the same thing that Vietnam was back in the 1960s. Okay, so the North Vietnamese army was called the Viet Cong, and it was trying to take over South Vietnam. Okay, so the North are communists, and they're trying to get control of South Vietnam. All right, so if we look at this map, okay, so up here, this is where Japan is, this is China, and then right here, okay, right here, this is North Vietnam, and this is South Vietnam. All right, North and South. So the North is communist and trying to get control of this part of South Vietnam. Okay. This photograph, this is a quote from this man in this photograph, who is very, very famous now. He will go down in history as being super famous and a really, really important man in history. Okay, if we have to fight, we shall fight. You will kill 10 of our men and we will kill one of yours. And in the end, it will be you who will tire of it. Okay, so this is Ho Chi Minh, and he's the leader of North Vietnam. Okay, so he's one of the most famous dictators in history. All right, so it's Ho Chi Minh who's going after South Vietnam and kind of trying to get this whole thing moving. All right, so this leads us to the domino theory. Okay, so in the early 1960s, the U.S. sent troops to help South Vietnam because they wanted to stop the spread of communism. Okay, so the United States sends help to South Vietnam and is like, hey, we'll back you, we'll support you in support of democracy and beating communism. We'll help you out. Okay. The United States mostly wanted to do that because many people believed that if Vietnam became communist, all of Southeast Asia would soon come under communist control. And that's why it's called the domino theory. Because if you ever see dominoes stacked up, you know what happens. If you hit one domino, they all fall into each other and they each knock each other down. Okay, so the United States has this theory called the domino theory, saying that, okay, if we allow North Vietnam to take over South Vietnam and become communist, then it's going to spread to the other southeastern countries in Asia. And then eventually communism is going to be all over Asia and we're not going to be able to stop it. So they're basically like supporting South Vietnam in order to stop the domino theory from coming true. Okay, so here are some pictures from Vietnam. A lot of you may have like uncles or grandpas or family members that were in Vietnam. A lot of people, a lot of American soldiers went to Vietnam. Okay, this is another time in U.S. history where the draft was enacted, which again, a draft is where the government basically forces you, if you're a male between ages 18 and I think it's like 30 something, you are forced to go serve in the military because they need a lot of people to help fight this war. Okay, this photograph is showing a US B-66 destroyer and 4 F-105 Thunder Chiefs dropping bombs on North Vietnam. Okay, so protests. This is a huge, huge part of the Vietnam War. Okay, so the Vietnam War was not popular with many Americans. Nobody really favored this war. Okay, there were many, many, many protests against American military troops fighting in Vietnam. Not really very many Americans wanted this war. They did not believe in it. They were kind of like, it's their country, it's their problem. We shouldn't be getting involved. This is only about 10, 15 years after World War II had started had ended. So, they're kind of like, we just got out of a war that, at first we didn't really want to get into. So we shouldn't have to go to this war and people shouldn't be dying for this and, stuff like that. This is also the time where we get the hippie generation, where people are literally, and I'm not kidding you guys, they are literally willing to lay down in front of tanks if they think it'll stop the war. Okay, there are many protests going on. There's peaceful protests. There's violent protests. There's bed protests where people decided to sleep in their beds all day and refuse to leave in order to protest this war. There are people who are out planting flowers and ripping up draft cards and all these other things. They are protesting the American government, saying, why are you doing this? Okay. This is a perfect example, right? This is a student protest in Wisconsin in 1965. And you can read and see in their faces how serious they are about this. It says, no more war in Vietnam. Use your head, not your draft card. End the war in Vietnam. Peace in Vietnam. Okay. Nobody really liked this war. And it was especially the younger generation, the people who were in college or in high school or were young adults who were fighting against the government, and the older generations who thought that it was a good idea to go into Vietnam. The younger generation was kind of standing up and saying, no, we shouldn't be in Vietnam. This is a bad idea. We should have peace, peace, love, and happiness and all that other jazz. That's kind of what they were preaching this whole time. All right, so next thing, it's a really fascinating subject, you guys. So I'm sorry if this video goes on too long. It's extremely fascinating to me how willing these people were to do anything in order to see this change. But moving on. Vietnam today. The Vietnam War ended in a ceasefire. Basically, what a ceasefire is kind of like a tie. Both sides agree to stop fighting. Okay, so not only did the American people not support this war, but on top of that, the United States didn't even really win. Nobody won. It was a tie. It was a pointless war where both sides just said, "You know what? Okay, this is kind of dumb. Let's stop fighting." So at that point, it's kind of like, why were we here in the first place? Why did we lose all those thousands and thousands of soldiers? Like, what was the point, right? So the United States ended up withdrawing its troops in 1973. Okay. About 2 years later, North Vietnam took control of the country, and Vietnam is now one country under communist rule. So, again, not only is it a ceasefire to where nobody wins, but on top of that, the whole reason why the United States got into the war in order to stop the spread of communism ended up happening anyway. So, the United States was not able to stop it or prevent it or anything like that. So, this, as you can imagine, angers the American people for the most part. This photograph is showing a CIA employee that helped the South Vietnamese evacuees onto an Air America helicopter. Okay, so they're trying to get people out of South Vietnam who want to be evacuated before North Vietnam gets control of it. Okay, so this is a whole nother issue in the Cold War also. I think I'm gonna leave this for another video. So I'll upload this part of the presentation separately, so that you guys don't have to listen to me talk and ramble on for a whole other 20 minutes. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope this made a little bit more sense. And I'll catch you on the next video.